I'd like to start out the message today by reading an excerpt from a favorite book of mine that might make you think a little bit if you haven't thought in this manner before. I read this when I was a young man, before I was married and before I had children, and it changed the way I think, and I have never forgotten it, and in fact my thinking around it has grown and evolved over time. So the excerpt goes like this. It says, "Clear your mind of everything except what you will read, or in this case hear, and what it will invite you to do. Don't worry about your schedule, your life, your business, your family, or your friends. Just focus with me and really open your mind. In your mind's eye, looking ahead in your life, see yourself going to the funeral of a loved one. Picture yourself driving to the funeral parlor or chapel, parking the car and getting out. As you walk inside the building, you notice the flowers, the soft organ music. You see the faces of friends and family you pass along the way, something I think we can all picture, probably have experienced. You feel the shared sorrow of losing, the joy of having known that radiates from the hearts of people there. As you walk down to the front of the room and look inside the casket, you suddenly come face to face with yourself. This is your funeral, however many years from today. All these people have come to honor you, to express feelings of love and appreciation for your life. As you take a seat and wait for the services to begin, you look at the program in your hand. There are to be 4 speakers. The first is from your family, immediate and also extended children, brothers and sisters, nephews, nieces, aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents who have come up from all over the country to attend. The second speaker is one of your friends, someone who can give a sense of what you were as a person. The third speaker is from your work or profession. And the fourth is from your church, where you've been involved in service. Now think deeply. What would you like each of these speakers to say about you and your life? What kind of a husband, wife, father, or mother would you like their words to reflect? Maybe we can add grandfather, grandmother. What kind of a son or daughter or cousin? What kind of a friend? What kind of a work associate? What character would you like them to have seen in you? What contributions, what achievements would you want them to remember? Look carefully at the people around you. What difference would you like to have made in their lives? I read that as a young man. It's from the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, written by Stephen Covey, in a chapter where he discusses one of the habits, begin with the end in mind. It changed my life. It changed my life. In this sense, as a young man, you don't tend to look to something such as the end of your life. As a young woman, maybe as a teenager, or a young person, a child. It's not natural, is it? You're thinking about the now, maybe the near-term future, where your life's going. But it changed my life because it was the first time I ever looked at life and tried to understand, what do I want my legacy to be? Not just a legacy of living a godly life and being in the kingdom, but the process of life and what I go through and how I impact people, how I help them and change their lives. What will I be like as a husband, a father someday if I get that opportunity? What will I be like as a church member, as a co-worker, a friend, a family member? How about you? What will be your legacy? What do you want people to say about you? Have you ever thought of that? In 1982, on March 30th, an individual began what would become a legacy. Now, he had been called by God to also begin other legacies prior. But in that day, March 30th, 1982, Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, who resided in Pasadena, California, near the Ambassador College campus, in the church headquarters of the Worldwide Church of God, visited Amman, Jordan. And he visited with King Hussein, perhaps the day before. I don't know exactly when he did visit with King Hussein at the time on that trip. But he was introduced at that time to the brother of King Hussein, Prince Hassan. And Prince Hassan asked him to visit a center for the mentally challenged that had been started by his wife, Princess Sarvith al-Hassan. And so Mr. Armstrong on that day visited that center where children from kindergarten up to their late teens were being taught, trained, educated, rehabilitated. Most of the children having Down syndrome. If we have experience with an individual with Down syndrome, they tend to be very pleasant, happy people to be around. I've had that experience many times in my life. Perhaps you have as well. And after he visited this center called the Young Muslim Women's Association Center for the Mentally Challenged, he wrote this in their guest book. And imagine Mr. Armstrong, those of you who remember him, you can almost hear him saying this. He says, "A new and heartwarming experience to visit this school. It is a mission of love to the handicapped who need that love and training so sorely, and an important contribution to the whole society as well." Exclamation point. "I shall count it a privilege to have a small part by a grant from the Ambassador Foundation." Herbert W. Armstrong, Pasadena, California. Mr. Armstrong sent that small donation. And a year later, in the fall of 1983, he sent 8 volunteers from Ambassador College. 8 volunteers. And he began a legacy that continues till today. And we have 5 today that are the next generation, the next iteration of that legacy. Still going on. I don't know if Mr. Armstrong, when he wrote this, had any idea of what the legacy was going to be. Maybe he did the day he wrote this. But he died a little time after that, and yet long after he has left, their legacy goes on. We all have the opportunity to build a legacy individually. We sit here today, all of us in here, not just the volunteers going to Jordan, all of us have the opportunity to be a part of a group that builds a legacy. But the group that we're involved with that builds a legacy in which we get to participate in builds a legacy that's eternal. Question I always ask is, the legacy we're building in Jordan, is it eternal? Is the legacy we're building in the church, all of you as you participate in what the church does, me as I participate, you young people as you participate, is your legacy, the part of the legacy that you are involved in, eternal? Well, it is. What is your legacy? What is mine? And how will our legacy impact the mission of God's church? Which we know to be to preach the gospel to the whole world, and then shall the end come. I remember back in 1991, it was in the spring of the year, and I took a trip to Amman, Jordan. I hadn't been there for a while. I had left Amman the year before, back in the summer of 1990, along with my wife. You see, my wife and I had been married on July 22nd, 1990, and we were heading to Amman, Jordan, to be a part of the Jordan Project. And on the last day of our honeymoon, we were fortunate to be able to have a Greek cruise as a honeymoon on our way over back to Jordan. We found out on the last night that Saddam Hussein, the dictator in Iraq, had invaded Kuwait. And as I brought my young bride into Amman, as we drove to our apartment and were being dropped off a mile from our apartment, there were students, college students, near the University of Jordan burning American flags and burning Israeli flags because the Americans were sending ships over to the Persian Gulf. It was quite a thing to take my young wife into. What do you do? Where do you go? We stayed for about a week. We left, spent a couple weeks in London, and we were advised from Jordan that perhaps you should head back to the States and let's watch this thing play out. When I got back to the United States, I promised my boss, Mr. Joseph Locke, that I would give it 1 year, and if the project didn't reopen, then I would probably be moving back to Minnesota with my wife. And so eventually, as we closed down the project for that year, we decided in the spring of the following year that the situation was safe enough, secure enough for us to go back into the country. And so we arranged to have someone pick us up as we went to meet with the individuals that we worked with over there. It was just Mr. Locke and myself. We flew over. And as we got out of the plane and we came down the jetway in the tunnel, much to our surprise, there was one of the members of the royal family. His name was Prince Rod. And he was standing there at the end of the tunnel. And when he saw us, and he had his armed guards around him, he had this big smile on his face. A big smile. A prince was smiling at me. And he was smiling at Joseph Locke. Why? Was it really me? Was it really Joseph Locke? What was it? He sat at the end of the jetway in the tunnel, and as we walked up, much to our shock and surprise, not that we wouldn't necessarily see him on the trip, but that he would be there waiting for us, he put his arms out and he hugged us. Why? Well, it was because a legacy had been broken, but it was now being healed. You see, all those years after Mr. Armstrong had been there and sent volunteers in, that legacy had been broken many years later due to this war. And now it was being healed. We were the first group, we were told anyway, to come back into Jordan, to commit to coming back in at the time. And he was happy. He was happy because the legacy was going to continue. I had no idea when the project started back up, nor would have Mr. Locke, nor would have anybody involved in it, that over 30 years later, that legacy would still go on. What does that mean? What does that legacy mean? What is our legacy? What about the church? Because really being in Jordan, living in a foreign land, is really not a whole lot different than living here. Because we live in a foreign land. This really isn't our land. We might think it is. But our land, our world, our nation is something far different. So we live in a world that's really not the world we want to live in, but we live here. We live in a culture that we don't really want to live in all the time, do we? We live in a world where morals, and values, and the way people act, and perhaps often what they say is not what we want to be a part of. But we have to live in this world. What will be our legacy? You know, legacy is defined as something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or predecessor from the past. We receive something, and then we pass it on. We carry it forward. You know, in the Jordan Project, we have had since 1983, that first year Mr. Armstrong sent volunteers, we have had 22 project years. 22 years in which we have sent volunteers. In Jordan, they don't see a disconnect from the 1983 group to the 2017 group. They don't. Ambassador College might be gone. They don't know much about the changes in churches and organizations. They don't know much about that. They know there's a church behind it, certainly, a belief system. But they see it as a legacy. They see it as a continuation. This year's volunteers are a continuation of the 1983 volunteers. One of them was from this area, John Andrews. Many of you will remember the Andrews and remember John Andrews. In that span of time, and I did recalculate this Jordan group because I had an error in my Excel sheet, the always dependable Excel sheet. 188 volunteers have passed through Jordan. It's had an impact on many lives going over there to serve. Some of you have gone over to feasts. Dusty and Jan Ellison went over this year to participate in the first part of the Spring Holy Days with that group of volunteers. 34 years after the first group of volunteers left for Jordan in the fall of 1983, a group of 5 leaves this Wednesday. They will live amongst a people of a different religion and belief system, a different culture, in most cases a different color of skin, and yet a people with a very bright future ahead of them, like the whole world, despite the dark world in which they live. They're no different than you and me back here in Minnesota or wherever you're from, visitors. We live in a world amongst our family. Most of our families are not called into the Church of God. In a world of friends, in a world of co-workers, in a world of classmates. That's the world we live in. Our family, our friends, our co-workers, our classmates, or whoever it is we live with in this life, live in a dark world. But they all too have a very bright future. What is our role related to their future? What will be your legacy when you project to the end of your life? What will be mine as relates to that? That's what I want to talk about for the remainder of the time that I have. I want to talk about perhaps 2 of the most important facets of leaving a godly legacy as relates to this world in which we live. Personal legacy. The 2 points of legacy, the 2 facets that I will bring to you today are what I hope would be said about me by my children, by my wife, by all of you, by my friends, and by others. I would hope that would be the case. You see, as I've grown older since the time I read from Stephen Covey's book, my view of legacy has changed, and it's grown and it's hopefully expanded thanks to God. How about you? What will be your legacy? What will people say about you as you interacted with a world of people in a dark world that have a very bright future? What will they say about you? I want to talk about what I think are the 2 most incredible aspects. There are many aspects I'm sure, about our legacy that we want, but two of the most incredible. The first of the two. This is what I hope people say about me. That I have a legacy of a life lived with moral excellence. I hope people say about me and say about you and say about all people called out into the church of God that you and me were examples of a life lived with moral excellence based on God's ways, His truths, His laws, His values. Now, not everyone's going to get up at my funeral or your funeral and trumpet that out, but I hope that's the tenor of what would be said. Vince Lombardi, the famous motivational coach, said the following: perfection is not attainable, but if we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. This group of people, the 5 volunteers going over, young people in the audience, we chase moral perfection. It's hard to attain. We chase it. We ask God to be involved and to give us that moral excellence based on His teachings, His word, His life that He puts in us. But I agree with that. If we chase perfection, we can catch excellence. And in this case, moral excellence. Will it be said about us in the church? Will it be said about this new group of volunteers that they chased perfection, and at the worst case, they represented moral excellence? You know, volunteers went over in 1983. In the intervening years, my wife and I lived in Amman, Jordan for 5 years in my case, 4 years in Colleen's case. And then, about the time we were leaving, the Church of God was going through a tremendous trial. A trial which I have never seen in my life in the church. And we have all seen many trials. And those of us that remember that monumental trial know exactly what I'm talking about. The year was 1995. And the leadership of the church was telling us that all the things we believed in didn't stand, or at least many of the things we believed in didn't stand anymore. They didn't matter. The things that we counted as moral excellence, as virtues from God, as a part of His laws, His ways, His plan for us, His plan for mankind. They were telling us, no, those don't matter anymore. And there was a group of people in the church that said, no, we're not giving that up. We're not giving it up. But that leadership did not want to build on the legacy that had been handed to them. Yes, it had been handed by their predecessors, by people like Mr. Armstrong, by other ministers, by other people in the church. They didn't want to carry on that legacy, and so they left it. And there was great tragedy in the wake of that, because a year later, for example, the Jordan Project closed down. A year after Colleen and I left, it closed. How do you think we felt? How do you think all those volunteers felt that had invested their time? They felt it was a tragedy. Fast forward to February 2007, 12 years later. 12 years later. Dateline, Amman, Jordan. Location, the Royal Palace. I was in Jordan to visit because we had a feast there that year. So I took a pre-trip in for planning. And I visited our sponsor our gracious, kind, visionary sponsor, who's still a gracious, kind, visionary sponsor. Mr. Kylo wrote about her in our Discern magazine, Princess Sarvith El Hassan. And I was there just simply to say hi. Simply to say hi. To show respect to her. Maybe to reflect a bit on the past. I had asked Mr. David Register, it's a name many of you will know, to join me on that visit because he was down in Egypt just prior for one of our church educational trips, and so it was convenient for him to fly to Amman. And I said, Mr. Register, can you please join me? Because I want them to get to know other people in our church. It's been a long time. It's 12 years since we left. We'd been back there, but it was 12 years since we left living there. So we sat with Princess Sarvith, and she reminisced. She talked about Herbert W. Armstrong and what a visionary he was. He was sending volunteers into the Middle East when it wasn't even vogue yet to send volunteers into the Middle East. He believed in exchange between people in their minds before it was vogue, before it was the in thing, at least in that part of the world. Maybe not in other parts, but certainly in that part of the world. She talked fondly of him. Then she looked at me, and she said, you know, we were meeting yesterday. I've told this story to this group before. She said, we were meeting yesterday, our board for the Amman Baccalaureate School, and ironically, with you coming today, we were talking about you. You being your group, not you, Cory. Your group. And she said, we discussed how we missed having your volunteers in Jordan. My heart started to pitter-patter. Oh, that felt good to hear that. They missed us. Felt good. But there was something far more important than me or even Mr. Register feeling good. She said, we discussed how when your volunteers went away, we've never been able to recapture that spirit. Our expatriate teachers who we spend good money on, they don't have that spirit. And then she described the spirit, how it played out. She said, your volunteers, they love our children. You see, we're sending 5 volunteers over, and the one thing that'll separate them from every other foreigner living in that country is that they will love those whom they serve. Love through the Spirit of God. That Spirit that Princess Sarvith talked about, didn't know what it was. That's the Spirit. That's no different than us as we live our daily lives here. It doesn't change. And then she looked at me and said, we want more volunteers. Will you send them? And I just looked at her, and I looked at Mr. David Register, and he knew I was looking at him because I wasn't going to answer her. I had no authority to answer her. And I just kind of looked at him with that look of good luck. And he looked her in the eye and he said, we will find a way to get you volunteers. And I was like, man, I like David Register. That guy's got some guts, because he didn't have approval either. And we did. God opened that door. That was not Dave Register's doing. It was not my doing. It wasn't even necessarily any one person's doing. It was God that opened that door. That was in 2007, and that fall we had 2 volunteers in. And here we are in 2017. Matthew 5 and verse 14 defines the legacy. how it is moral excellence is captured or emanated in Jordan or wherever it does through the Spirit of God, where love, real love, not love the way the world would define it, but real godly love, where we love those we serve. We apply God's morals, His values, His laws, His principles, His truth to our service. It says in Matthew 5 and verse 14, which is a major theme, not only of the project, but of the church. You are the light of the world. We are sending 5 volunteers to a dark world. A dark world. We live in a dark world. Dark as relates to God's values, His morals, His way of thinking. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Verse 15, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Verse 16, let your light shine, so shine before men, that they may see your good works, your moral excellence, and glorify your Father in heaven. Is there any more important legacy for any of you or me than that? Is there anything bigger in your calling that you can imagine than that? That people would observe you and what you stand for and glorify your Father, my Father in heaven. Now, one caveat to that, because you know where I stand on it. There is no more important thing, but there is a caveat. We don't know yet when they might glorify their Father in heaven. We have an idea when most of them will, and we'll review that. So it may not all happen. It was really nice to hear Princess Sarva, though we felt good that she observed. She didn't know exactly what she was observing, but she observed it. She observed moral excellence over and over and over again with every group, with the individuals that passed through. And so we were lucky enough to hear that that's what she observed. Don't know that she glorified her Father in heaven. Probably not. But she did observe. But we don't always hear that, do we? But wouldn't it be wonderful if that was our legacy? I can't give you any better legacy to strive for than that. I cannot. I couldn't dream up as a human being. You could not dream something up. None of us could. This is a legacy only God could say He wants. The definition of excellence is the quality of being outstanding or good. The quality of being outstanding or good. So moral excellence, then, is the quality of being outstanding in upholding and living out godly morals and values in an immoral world. It's the quality of being outstanding in upholding and living out godly morals and values in an immoral world. That's letting one's light shine, such that at some point in their lives, in their existence, they would glorify their Father in heaven. Moral excellence is the standard of thought, attitude, and behavior that literally represents God in a dark world. That's moral excellence. It's the standard of thought, attitude, and behavior that literally represents God in a dark world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, Jesus said. That is his definition of moral excellence. See, if you represent him and what he stands for, you can't be hidden. If you try to represent yourself, people will run from you. But there's something attractive. People like Princess Sarvath are attracted to moral excellence. A spirit, a love. How does the Bible define moral excellence? Well, there's many, many scriptures we could turn to. I'll turn to one. 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. Verse 5. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue. Virtue. Excellence. Moral excellence. Add to your faith virtue. Moral excellence. One commentary states that virtue is that which is recognized by all men as excellent. The excellence of man as man. We know excellence written in this context is the excellence of God playing out in our lives, in our character. Add to your faith virtue, or we could say moral excellence. To virtue, knowledge. You see, our excellence in moral behavior and thought and attitude and how we represent ourselves before mankind is based on the knowledge of God, His truth, His laws, His values. Verse 6, to knowledge, self-control. We don't deviate. We're consistent. It's self-control. To self-control, perseverance. When we want to give up, we don't. We keep plowing forward with moral excellence. To perseverance, godliness. To godliness, brotherly kindness. And brotherly kindness, to brotherly kindness, love. This is the definition of moral excellence. For if these things are yours and abound, you will neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. You will be that light set on a hill. You know, we talk about these scriptures all the time. But do they rank supreme on where we want to be at the end of our life? That is what defines us. That's what people will say about you and me. Does that burn inside of us? Young people, as you look to your bright futures and your futures and the families you will have and all those wonderful blessings from God, is this your future? Is this what's going to define you? To the children in the audience. You know, the famous philosopher Aristotle said that one time, and he was quoted as saying, excellence is an art won by training and habituation. We do not act rightly because we have virtue or excellence, but rather have those because we have acted rightly. We are what we repeatedly do. Aristotle may have been wrong about a lot of things, but he's not wrong about that. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. I agree with that. Excellence is something that's consistent. It happens over and over and over again. It's dependable. When they see you, they hear you, they interact with you, people can say, I get the same thing over and over and over again. It's not a single act. It's not an every once in a while. It's a habit. It goes on and on and on. So that's the first of the two facets I want to bring to you today. When you think of your legacy, when the volunteers going over think of their legacy, and we've talked a lot about this already, they wouldn't have been selected if that was not their reputation. I mean, no one's perfect. I'm sure none of them would want to be presented as perfect in this. I wouldn't want to be represented that way. None of us would want to be represented that we're perfect. But like Lombardi said, if you go after that perfection, you're going to at least attain excellence. We seek perfection, but we attain excellence. That's number one. The second one I bring to you today is this. It's a legacy of a life lived according to a godly purpose. Now, if I asked you to define God's purpose for your life and your calling, you would have many things to say about that, as would I. We're going to look at some aspects of that. When you think of the end of your life and what people will say about you or think about you, will it be a legacy of a life lived according to a godly purpose? Will they see you as a person who seemed to live and do and say and breathe everything according to a purpose that you believed in? They may not understand, all of them, that godly purpose that you lived for. But will there be that essence about you? I hope that that's what people say about me. Maybe won't have been perfect in that the whole time, but that was my general ethos. That was my general character. Winston Churchill once said, "It's not enough to have lived. We should be determined to live for something." We all know that. We know that it's not enough to just be alive. We know it's not even enough to just be called according to God's purpose. We know that we need to live for something. That God will accomplish something special in our lives. The volunteers going to Jordan are hoping and praying for a special year. That something special happens not only to them in terms of their experiences, but more importantly, that something special happens to others through them, but according to God's purpose, not their own. And we've talked a lot about that in our training. The mission of the project according to God's purpose. The purpose for which we live is and will be the foundation of our legacy. What's your purpose every day of your life? What drives you when you get up in the morning? What's the first thoughts you have about what you're going to accomplish that day? How you're going to interact with people? What you're going to say? What you're going to do? How you're going to treat people? How you're going to do your job? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? What's the first thing that comes to my mind? This year, the theme for COGWA youth camps has been vision, seen clearly in a clouded world. And we've tried to teach the campers that God defines the vision for our lives, the vision for the work of the church. In other words, God defines the purpose. We start teaching our children that when they're this high. We were up at Woodlake Camp a week ago, and we were doing our best to teach the young people there, 1B and 1G, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, and then older, that God has a vision for them, a purpose, and He wants them to capture that vision. That's what we do in the church. We believe in living out according to God's purpose. Our legacy will be largely defined by the purpose for which we lived every day of our lives. Do we wake up every morning with a burning, palpable purpose? I'm not talking about the general purpose for which we live, to obey God and to be a part of His kingdom, but something very driving, which is going to dictate everything we think, say, and do and act out in our lives. Let's go to Exodus chapter 23. I want to talk about God's purpose for us in this context. Exodus 23. We know that God defines His purpose for us and mankind in His festivals, in His holy days. I'm going to take a little bit of a look at that today, a familiar set of scriptures. In verse 14 of Exodus 23, it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. We could say Passover and unleavened bread, they go together. Verse 16, and the feast of harvest, or what we would call Pentecost, the first fruits of your labors which you have sown in the field, and the third, the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, or what we refer to as the great harvest. 3 harvests here when you have gathered in the fruit of your labor. God's purpose for you and for me, and what should be burning in our lives day in and day out is defined right here. That he has three great harvests. Three. The first, Passover and unleavened bread, which pictures the start of all harvests. When Jesus Christ came to this earth as God in the flesh and gave his life so that not only we sitting here could be saved, but all the people in the world could be saved. The people that Jordan volunteers go to serve. And as far as we know, most of them are not being called at this time. That first harvest, the harvest of Jesus Christ, pictures not only our salvation and our ability to overcome sin and Satan and society, but theirs. When I said that the people in Jordan have a bright future, they do. Because Jesus Christ was harvested. He gave his life. And the plan moves forward. Then we have the second harvest, the harvest of the first fruits. You, me, called according to God's purpose. To do what? To live this life of moral excellence. And to serve and to love, as Princess Sarvith described. And finally, this feast of ingathering, the great harvest. 7.4 billion people live on the earth today. 7.4 billion, give or take, that's what they estimate. In 2012, the BBC estimated that just over 100 billion had lived on this earth. I don't know how they came up with that number. If I knew, I probably wouldn't agree. But let's face it, it's safe to say tens of billions of people have lived on this earth. I think we'd all kind of at least ballpark it there, right? I feel okay with that. I'm not a real scientist here. But the reality is that the tens of billions that have most probably lived are probably represented in that third festival, right? They're represented there in the great feast of the ingathering. The great harvest, we call it. We know that. We picture that in the fall holy days. And they will be harvested in the millennium and the great white throne judgment. Who are these people? Well, today they're Muslims, they're Jews, they're Christians, Christian faiths of this world. They're of all religions. They are atheists, they are agnostics. Anyone else alive? That's who they are. Most of that 7.4 billion are represented in that group. They're made up of Arabs, Jews, Israelites, you name the ethnicity. That's who they're made up of. The color of their skin is black, it's white. It's all colors on the earth. That's who they are. It's the whole earth. And it's all those that came before them that were never called as a part of the first fruits, the second harvest of the great three that we picture in the 7 annual holy days. And this great harvest intersects with these 5 young people going to Jordan. This great harvest intersects with your life today, with mine. It's not just something off in the future. There's a responsibility we have to it now. That's why the project in Jordan exists. I've told the volunteers during their time here, you are not going to Jordan just to get a great volunteer and life-changing experience, because if that's what it was, go work for the Peace Corps. Go to some other group. The church doesn't need to invest in that. That's not why they're going. Let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. You know, while you're turning there, you can think about this. We talk about them going because they have a responsibility to those in the great harvest, most of which represent people they will serve in Jordan. They have a responsibility to live out Matthew 5, verses 14 to 16, in that world, just like we have a responsibility to live it here. They have a responsibility to live these things out. You know, some people are legacy builders. Herbert W. Armstrong was a legacy builder. We want to see ourselves as legacy builders, builders of God's legacy, not our own, but legacy builders. There are legacy crashers. I remember my last year in Jordan, and Colleen was there, and she'll remember this. You see, we would send donations and volunteers to a couple of the schools for the mentally and physically challenged every year, actually 3 of them. And Mr. Armstrong's successor, leading the Church of God, he didn't have the same vision. He didn't want anything to do with Mr. Armstrong's legacy. He didn't care about going over to Jordan. In our years there, he went, in fact, I don't think he ever went during our years. But he would send donations still, and he kept the project alive. I don't know why. Because he didn't believe in the legacy of his predecessor. He really didn't. But something happened that last year I was there. Because after a donation was sent, he got a thank you letter addressed to Dear Mr. John Tkach. And Mr. Joe Tkach got very mad, and he was going to shut the project down because these people didn't even know his name. But he never cared enough to go, visit them, to see the children, to see what the volunteers were really doing, to see the legacy of love that was special and unique that God had given. That's a legacy crasher. People who try to tear down the past. I have no time for people who want to tear down Herbert Armstrong, an imperfect man, just like all of us. So if you want to do that, go talk to somebody else. You know why? If for no other reason, and there are many reasons I wouldn't want to tear him down, he was a legacy builder, not a legacy crasher. So I like to talk about legacy builders. I like to be positive. That's what we're about, building a legacy, a godly legacy. In 1 Peter chapter 2, in verse 11, it takes Matthew 5 to the next level. It takes it to the great harvest. It takes being a light before mankind to the great harvest and to our obligation. It says in verse 11, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, referring not just to people going to Jordan, referring to all of us. We're all sojourners and pilgrims on this earth. It doesn't share our values. But being sojourners and pilgrims, we're asked to abstain from fleshly lusts, from the sins of this society, from its moral values, which war against the soul. Verse 12, having your conduct honorable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works which they observe, no different than what Christ preached in Matthew 5, by your good works which they may observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. You see, we don't all get Princess Arvit to say, oh, the Spirit, the love. We don't all get that. But there will be a day if we stand for moral excellence, and if that's who we are, if that's our legacy, and if we live according to God's purpose, and that's what drives us day in and day out, then there will be a day that they will honor their Father in heaven. And they won't be able to look at you and me and say, you know what, Jesus Christ, you called those people, but look at those miserable wretches. They didn't follow what you're telling me. They didn't live it. You see, those that have a legacy of moral excellence according to God's values, that live according to God's purpose, will be able to be written down in the book of life and be able to be articulated by Christ as ones who stood for what He called us to do. No black marks on the church. No black marks on the work of God. No black marks on the preaching of the gospel. People who lived God's way. It's all so simple in a way, but it's all big. It's all big. Do we really believe that our moral excellence given to us by God, not necessarily coming from perfect people, but ones who are dedicated, trying to attain perfection, do we believe that our moral excellence, as God lives it out in our lives through His Spirit, can be used in the millennium, in the great white throne judgment? Can it be a source of credibility to the calling, where Christ will be able to say, you know, they lived in a dark world, and it wasn't easy. They had their failures, but you know what? They grew. And what do you have to say about them? What do you people from Jordan have to say about them? What will they say? What will be our legacy? What will they say? What will they have seen? We are so blessed to be able to be not only chosen to be different, but to dare to be different, to have the courage through God's Spirit to be different. What will be your legacy? What will be your legacy? What will be mine? What will be the legacy of the project volunteers? I've given you two things that I think are central to our calling. That if I had to pick two, they would be mine. They would be mine. What is going to be yours? In conclusion, project to that day when people will gather to ponder your legacy. Can you do that? Can you see the end of your life? It's not morbid when you look at it in this way. Project to that day when they'll gather to ponder your legacy. What will they say? Will they say, here lies a man whose legacy was a life of moral excellence? Or here lies a woman who strove to live every day of her life according to God's purpose? This is a legacy we all hope for. This is a legacy we all pray for. This is a legacy that only God can deliver. Only God. Godspeed, and God impart His courage to our new set of Jordan volunteers. And Godspeed and God impart His courage to all of us here and all of His people around the world carrying out His great legacy.